conflicted about this. I'm going to get into how I got into the first open housing march that I participated in, one of the early ones when they came down 15th Street. But I actually met Nancy about 2 weeks before this. She was living in the same building again. And frequently young guys in the building, which I was young at that time, were asked to carry furniture up to, whatever floor for damsels in distress or women who were living on the upper floors who couldn't get. And on this occasion, a guy knocked on my door and I said, "Oh no, not again. I'm busy now. I'm preparing lectures, but we got to move this. What is it?" And I said, Larry, his name was. "It's not a couch. It's not one of those pull-outs." And he said, "Well, it is a sleeper. It's not a pull-out." But anyway, it turned out to be a little day bed. It wasn't a big deal. But the two of us trucked it up the stairs. And there were two women there, a friend of Nancy's and herself, and I was just immediately struck. Now, my wife says that she has no memory of this incident whatsoever. Apparently, I made she made more of an impression on me than I did on her. And I can handle that now. But for the record, I want to say that we had met once before, very briefly, okay? But she was more fixated on the day bed than on how, the people carried it up there. So 2 weeks later, I could hear the marchers going down 16th Street. But they were off there in the distance, as they had been, figuratively speaking, in the earlier period of my life in Philadelphia. And that's good. You keep that up, and it's something good is bound to come of this. We hope. But something happened one night on 15th Street, around 15th and Kilburn. The street had been torn up, or there was some kind of sewers being replaced there. So the marchers came down, and Dick Gregory was there this night. I remember this very vividly. I didn't know it at the time, but suddenly the marchers got much, much closer to our building. And though I was in the back and Nancy was on the 4th floor in the front where she could see them, it became clear. I thought, well, what's going on here? The voices were much louder, and so I ran down to the front door. There were two entrances, one to the south end of the building, one on the north end. And I went down there, and we were looking out, and then here were all these marchers. They were coming across Kilburn, going east, and then turning at the corner. And they were, inviting us, "Come on, join in, march for justice, freedom, whatever." And I thought, well, it's one of these odd things that happen, as I think by luck or happenstance. And I really need to get up there and finish my classes for tomorrow, and I didn't want to do this. And then I looked up, happened to the Alliance North, and in the north entrance there was Nancy and a couple of her friends, and she was, boom, right into the light she went. She had her keys with her, apparently, or she knew what she was doing when she ran down from the 4th floor. So yours truly said, well, okay, I'm for justice too, I'm for open housing, and to this day I think, well, would I have joined in that march if here's my chance to talk to her. And anyway, one thing led to another. We marched over the viaduct that night, and this must have been about maybe the 15th or 20th night of the marches, and as you know, they went on for 260 some days, I think. Well, we got very well acquainted that night over and back. What I remember when we got to the halfway across that bridge, the 16th Street, there was the noise, the thunderous, shouting and screaming from the south end of the bridge, and I remember being very frightened, and I looked around, and there were young people there. I mean, kids, some of them 12, 13 years old, it looked like, and younger, marching across the bridge. Well, they had done it all before, but I couldn't turn back, and plus there was this woman I was talking to, I was trying to impress, and I thought, well, I was scared. And I think still from that day to this, what's often not talked about, is just taken for granted or assumed, I think, is the courage, the raw courage of these people walking into these situations where people were throwing rocks and bottles and screaming racial epithets and all sorts of other things. Despite the police protection, I remember thinking the commanders are really doing a good job here, the youth council, but boy, I don't know whether they can protect us. But we all lived through that night. And on the way back, Nancy said she had to. We passed almost right by our building again. She was dropping off at that point. It had been an incredible experience. But for some reason, I went on. I went back to St. Boniface, where the, Father Groppi was co-pastor or whatever his title was. And I remember very vividly, Dick Gregory had been on some sort of hunger fast for something. Maybe it was the marches, but I remember how skeletal he looked and how passionate he was and how articulate he was. And then Father Groppi came out. I don't know where he had been while Gregory was speaking. He must have been back in the sanctuary somewhere. But he came out, and as I recall, I think he had some sort of stole on. He wasn't fully vested, but he was, I knew who he was from seeing his picture in the paper and on television. But he wanted this, I remember thinking, he wants us to remind us, and maybe just me, that he was a priest. And he launched into what can, I guess, I better say, a spirited denunciation of a sitting judge in Milwaukee, whose name I won't mention, but anyone who was here at that time probably knows of whom I'm speaking. This judge, it seems, a few days before, and I remember hearing about this incident or reading about it, had sentenced a young African-American male to jail for something, whatever it was. And I think that, as I remember the story, he recognized this defendant in his courtroom as one of the activists, maybe a commando, I don't know, in the marches. I'm not sure about that. But as the fellow was leaving the courtroom escorted by the bailiffs to serve his sentence, I almost said the name there. The judge said, "Wait a minute, Mr. So-and-so." He said, "Wait a minute, I have one other thing to say to you." And he gestured to him. And he said, "I just want to point out to you and the courtroom here, that this is one instance in which you shall not overcome." I couldn't get over that. I mean, and reading. So here comes Father Groppi out, and it was incredible. I looked around the church, and all of a sudden, I see all these young people again, and obviously very poor people and people without a lot of formal education. Some of them, there were some, priests and clerics and others there as well, and I just thought, I'm teaching history. I'm this little instructor, full-time instructor at this little college, and I don't know anything. And I certainly didn't, until that point, ever think of myself as anything like an active agent in historical events. And I was ashamed. I still have a little trouble, obviously, talking about this, but so I decided that I would be more active, and I was in maybe another 10 or 12 marches, but I went to meetings, and I started going to the church, St. Boniface, regularly. I hadn't been a regular. Well, I was sort of in other churches in Milwaukee, but I became a more active supporter of the movement. And eventually, I talk about feeling guilty because of my reluctance to engage, but then I end up marrying this incredible woman, and it was a few years later, in 1970. Nancy had been, unlike myself, as a teenager in the Bronx and in Brooklyn. She was born in the Bronx. When I got to know a little about her, she had been very involved in something called the Grail. It's a well-kept secret, an international, in origin Catholic movement of lay women. They weren't then or are not now priests or nuns, or certainly not priests. It's the Catholic Church and its wisdom has decided that one half of its congregants are lesser human beings or whatever. But anyway, I don't want to get into the women's ordination issue, but but Nancy had this. The Grail was dedicated to spirituality and transforming the world. These young women. It started in Amsterdam in the interwar years, and the Grail women would hold counter demonstrations and marches against the Hitler Youth, the Hitlerjugend, and the build-up to the Nazi takeover of Germany. And then it moved to the United States and all around the world. Its international, or its national headquarters are outside of Cincinnati, Ohio, in Loveland, Ohio. In fact, we are going there in a few days for Easter services. We've been going there for years. But here, I discover in the course of the marches and the months afterward that not only is this woman devastatingly beautiful and charming and lovely, but she's got this deep conviction that one's faith or beliefs involve action, in the world. The Grail women were never removed from the world. They're professionals, many of them, and they're engaged, as I had never been. So we were married, and on December 26, 1970, my birthday, my 28th birthday. We've been married for 40 years now, and we've raised 2 children, and during that time, our activism was somewhat lessened or diminished because we were older, new parents. Both of our children were adopted, and we didn't have time for a lot, but we did what we could. But then this is, again, I don't think it's fate, but happenstance. We're in the 1980s now, and we had bought a home, a duplex on the northwest side, north of Sherman, the Sherman Park area, about 5 blocks north of Capitol Drive. Anyway, one day we hear in the neighborhood, by the way, it was a neighborhood, I like this, in transition, But since our children were both adopted and biracial, and we had lived with a biracial couple for a number of years in a duplex when we were first married, they had children, and everybody seemed to be getting along all right in that neighborhood in transition. We bought a home there, a little north of there, and one day we were heard from a neighbor, a very anxious neighbor, anxious about this, that Father Groppi, lo and behold, and his wife, now Peggy, Peggy Razga, were moving into the neighborhood. And in fact, they were moving right around the corner from us. And this older man who told us about this he was going on about, the commanders are going to be overrunning the neighborhood, and they're going. I said, come on. I mean, these people have moved on. They have careers. Some of them are bankers, and, whatever they are, professors, and this would be great having them. So we, when Jim and Peggy moved in, we went over. I had baked a cake, actually, from a mix. I had never tried this before. And we welcomed them to the neighborhood, along with some other people. A few years passed, and Jim developed brain cancer, as you know, and eventually died of it. And we had become pretty close with Jim and Peggy because we had a daughter, have a daughter still, who's now married and living in Alaska. She's 31 now. And Jim and the Groppis, Jim and Peggy, had a daughter who was a year older than our daughter and one a year younger. And our son, the older of our 2 children, was way beyond Matthew Groppi's age. And Matthew was the third of Jim and Peggy's children. The youngest was about 3, I think, when Jim died. So in getting to know them, we became fast friends, and then when he was dying, the decision was made to bring him. He wanted to die at home, and so they brought him back, and they set up a hospital bed in the dining room of this 2-story home. And it became pretty evident that the strain on Peggy, who was working to complete her PhD in, I think it's English or American Lit, I'm not sure which, but she teaches at UW Waukesha now. The strain of going to school, doing her coursework, getting the dissertation written, defending it, raising 3 children with the husband dying, and the whole city, not the whole city, but many people anxiously, calling and asking what they can do. So a group of women, my wife among them, but they asked what could be done. I mean, everybody was asking, how can we help? And Peggy said, well, it's really hard to get meals on the table, and I'm studying, working during the day, and come home. And so these women organized 5 nights a week, Sunday through Thursday. They would bring meals in throwaway containers. First, they got menus of what the kids liked, what they would eat. And they brought this in at a certain time in the side door of the house and just said, hello, goodbye, here it is. And Peggy had, knew what was, what the meals were for each night. Some people cook way too much, so guess who got the excess? They brought it down to our house, some of the best food I've ever had in my life. And everybody knew they were sharing with others. And then, I think in imitation or response to that effort, when Peggy said she wasn't getting any sleep, because Jim was up and down with the medications all night long, and she had to come down from upstairs and take care of him. A group of men organized, and one of those was Don Richards, who I want to acknowledge right now, who at the time I think was already on the Common Council in Milwaukee, a former priest also and a close friend of Jim's. And somehow Don Richards and I got charged with organizing these men, and we just put out a call, and the response was overwhelming. All the civil rights activists, anti-war activists, bus drivers, union people. Jim was the head of the bus drivers. We organized this so that we would come in at night after, whatever the time was, we'd come in the front door with our own sheets and pillowcases. We'd pull out the couch to sleep on, and we would arrive. Peggy wouldn't see us. The front door was open. She'd be upstairs taking care of the kids. We would be in the living room sleeping while Jim was in the dining room in the hospital bed, and whatever he needed during the night we would do. It was incredible. So, and he died, I think it was in 1985. But that was a powerful life-altering experience. And most pointedly, a few times when I was there with Jim overnight, he said, and I'm sure he said it to others as well, I assume he did, that if he recovered, when he recovered, he was going to be working on a new definition of ministry, and writing a book or something on this, and I've never forgotten that. So, then the rest of it was easy. I mean, seeing, everybody, or not, so many people we met through the Jim and Peggy and others involved in various movements that we just committed ourselves to doing it more than we had been doing and supporting, whatever cause. And now I think I'd like to add one last thing, if I may. I haven't given you a chance to ask any questions here, but when I taught in the Milwaukee Public School System for many years, and when I went back to teaching in 1981, you didn't have to be a real careful observer, a real able to pick up messages, or I was not shocked exactly, but disappointed by the lethargy of the students, and probably not unlike myself when I was in high school, but it occurred to me, but the apathy and the cynicism, the idea that nothing was ever going to change for the better, the government was bad, somehow an alien or enemy force, or a bumbling bunch of bureaucrats who just screwed things up. There was no hope for reform, and one day it occurred to me that the reason, especially for this anti-government cancerous talk that we have heard for so many years, and denunciation of the public sector, anything that the reason these students thought this way, and the hopelessness and the ennui, I don't know what to call it. I mean, apathy is probably the best word now. Also, that's the way it is, and that's the way it's going to be, is because they had never seen government or anybody else do much to change. You know, they hadn't lived through, they hadn't had the luxury that was afforded to me and others of our generation, you know, to see activism at its best and government responding to felt needs from pressure exerted from below, to be sure. But nothing changes without legislation, I think, in government action, whether we like it or not. But we had lived through such a, and they had. So I decided, I think more or less unconsciously it happened, I became a preacher, you know, denouncing consumerism, mindless consumerism, and the acquisitive culture that we fought, and the nation so wealthy, powerful, and not blessed but lucky, fortunate in terms of resources, and with such power and might and such high ideals expressed in our family that we clearly were not living up to, you know, whatever could reasonably be defined as the American creed, and that this was beyond sad, it was immoral, I think. So I think I crossed the line somewhere there from being an objective teacher trying to talk about the American past and relate it to the present, and I just jumped over to the Howard Zinn side and said, I'm going to talk about race, class, and gender. I want these young people ideally to be countercultural in the best sense of the word, to challenge existing institutions where it was needed, and to be mindful, you know, somehow that in this consumer circus that we've degenerated into, I think the kingdom of thingdom, as someone once called, that there's more to life than wealth and acquisition and having big fancy homes. There's also a question about, like, how well or poorly is the wealth of this or any other nation or culture distributed, and you know, that whole distributive side is left out. We always talk about growing the economy, expanding the economy, but rarely, even Marx, you know, admitted that. I did read the manifesto at one time, and I am a member of the Socialist Party now, Socialist Party USA, and proud of it. I have my membership card right here in my pocket. Wave it at the camera. But I think, you know, even Marx in the manifesto and other writings, I haven't read a lot of Marx, but in the manifesto he acknowledges that as far as the production side of an economy goes, there's nothing to compare to capitalism, never has been. But there's this other side, distribution and socioeconomic justice, and the idea that, well, here I'm back in the classroom, that socialism or anything that smacks of it is based on the premise that nobody should have anything. It's really based on the premise that there's enough here and in the world for everybody to have enough. You know, it's not a matter of this lifeboat mentality, you know, I got to get mine. Or so my students, especially in my AP classes, and others as well, tolerated this. What they took away from it, I don't know. But
let me take you back.
I had to change tape.
Okay. When I first talked to you on the phone, I asked you to describe what was it like marching, and you gave me a great, you know, do you remember what you said to me?
I think it was words to the effect, something like, I felt, well, it sounds trivial to say, energized, happy. Of course, I was happy to meet my wife in the march, or get to know. I felt more alive and more passionate and more hopeful than I felt in a long time, or ever before, really. And I also was, again, I'm repeating myself a little bit here, I guess I really was naive at that time. I had never thought about the courage that it took to do such things. I mean, I'm talking about, you know, the prospect of imminently having your head bashed in by a club or a rock or a bottle or something, or worse. And I just was